Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
Hello, welcome everybody. This is Natasha Helfer for the Natasha Helfer podcast, and we are doing our monthly panel as the Symmetry Solutions team, bringing you ideas about current news and events that we believe have an impact on the intersection of mental health, religion, sexuality, relationships, all the things that we're very passionate about here at Symmetry Solutions. And with me, I've got Jenny Elledge from Orlando, Florida. Say hello.
Hey, hi.
Alan Alexander from California. Hello, Alan.
Good morning, everyone.
And Michelle Peets, who's right here in Salt Lake City with me.
Hi.
Hi. All right, just to be clear, all of you are licensed in the state of Utah as well. We're going to be talking about some Utah issues, but that also have implications nationwide. So we're going to start with a topic that's I've already been on 2 podcasts about. It's just been a lot of different conversations around this case that has drawn so much attention in regards to Jodi Hildebrand and Ruby Franke. Moms of Truth is kind of the umbrella that they were working under. And what we've come to find out is that they were both arrested for child abuse in regards to Ruby's biological children, who were also living in the same residence as Jodi Hildebrand. And although that's very concerning in of itself, that any child abuse case is very concerning, what makes this case unique is that they were really proponents of giving a lot of parental advice. And then Jodi Hildebrand in particular has a long history of working in that intersection of sexuality with kind of ideas around porn and sex addiction, which we know are not clinically sound spaces to address unwanted sexual behavior or sexual betrayals in relationships. And in ways that were, even though, I'm concerned about the sex addiction model, there's, of course, I think people who offer those kinds of services in ways that were very, very different from what Jodi Hildebrand was offering, as far as the expectations of people moving out of their homes, of getting divorced, of repairing with, the church of her choice in order to be seen as mentally well or relationally well. So this intersection of therapists who kind of practice unethically due to their own religious biases and discriminations is very concerning. So I feel like plenty of people have had a chance to hear me talk about this on lots of formats. I'd love to hear from the 3 of you. So maybe Jenny, we'll start with you. I know you have to leave us at the top of the hour, but I'd love to hear kind of what you've been thinking about over the last few weeks as all this news has broken.
Yeah, it's been national news, I'm sure, at this point. So to hear about this Utah case has been concerning. I've listened to both podcasts that Natasha has been on. Mainly, I'm concerned about, because I only have so much time, about how the therapy world is responding to this case. And in the field of therapy, we take our ethics very, very seriously, like so seriously that it's kind of shocking to us for us to even consider or fathom that another professional would be so unethical. I mean, there are not child abuse, of course, is the number one thing that we're all very concerned with. But there have been flags, and people have been kind of concerned in our field about her for quite a number of years, and she has been reported. So it brings up all kinds of interesting dilemmas for us as therapists, kind of like how do we make sure our colleagues are doing good work? How do we show up in terms of reporting them, and what's the follow through like? I mean, and it seems like it might be different from state to state, but yeah, a lot of concern for me, of course, I'm sure for all of us, I can speak for all of us about the ethics that have been coughed many, many times over.
Yeah, and that brings up a really interesting point because I don't think any of us really want to be monitors of our colleagues, right? I think most of us want to respect our colleagues. We want to collaborate with our colleagues. Nobody wants to feel like the tattletale with colleagues in that regard. And at the same time, it is part of our ethical responsibility to make sure we are making reports when colleagues are not following ethical guidelines. That is actually in our code of ethics. So it does put us in that monitoring space, which I think sometimes kind of causes kind of a competition or a distrust among colleagues, like, oh, you're going to disagree with me on this particular issue. So now we're going to see ourselves as contrary to each other. But it is actually a very important part of protecting the public when therapists go off rails, in ways that are very, very damaging. Alan, what would you like to say? And then Michelle.
Yeah, about the protection of the public. That is why the licensing boards exist. I mean, they have more than one purpose. Sure, we have to meet educational requirements. We have to pass state exams, including law and ethics. But the main purpose of DOPL in Utah and the Board of Behavioral Sciences, the BBS here in California, is to protect the public from unethical and illegal practices by licensed professionals. That is their primary, that's their primary and highest goal and motive. So that monitoring that we do of each other is built in because there does need to be gatekeeping around the profession sometimes, because sometimes people do lose their way. And while it's customary to give another professional kind of a heads up that, hey, a client approached me and said, the following, and that's really concerning. And so I'm going to give you a chance to, report yourself. Otherwise, I am going to say something. So that serves a purpose. That purpose for that person to take responsibility and accountability for what they've done. But if that doesn't happen, then yes, we do gatekeep, and we are highly disturbed whenever anything like this occurs, because it paints the rest of us with a broader brush. It tarnishes the entire profession, and it dissuades the public from being able to come and get mental health when they really may need it the most. And there's already a huge stigma and huge barriers, especially in areas especially where there's cultural sensitivity around it, or there's high demand religion or other type of messaging that doesn't always serve to direct the public towards seeking the best help that they can. And that's really, really what's sticking in my craw about this.
Yeah, yes, very well said, Alan. Michelle, what would you like to add as far as your reactions to what's been happening the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that has risen to the surface for me is what you all have been touching on, which is, so what about the clientele that enters these spaces, particularly in talking about things of a sexual nature that is so sensitive and already so taboo in our American culture? How do clients know who they can go to and who they can't? And I know as therapists, the conversations I've had with my friends and colleagues have been around, when you work in your own wound, a lot of times you have a potential to do damage to your clients unknowingly, because you can have just that blind spot, or you can kind of bring into that clinical space some of the pain that you yourself experienced. And I think Jody Hildebrandt is a prime example of that. Mm-hmm. And so I know I've had a lot of conversations with colleagues about, okay, so can we require therapists to go through mandatory therapy themselves in their programs in graduate school? And from what I understand, a lot of schools do require it. A lot of programs don't. I know the program I went through, they always recommended it. They constantly mentioned it in classes, but there was no, there wasn't a way of enforcing that that was established. So in the face of I guess, a lack of like systematized work being done on therapists. I think it's important to start thinking about, okay, how can clients in their own sphere of influence check into who are they working with when they choose a therapist, because that's such a big choice and that's such an intimate choice. This is somebody who's going to be understanding and knowing much about the like deepest recesses of their lives. And while I'm not sure a client can necessarily ask a therapist, like, tell me your sexual trauma, tell me what you've been through, tell me about, all these different things that could potentially bias you. I mean, they could, I guess. I'm not sure a therapist would want to disclose all of that. A prospective client can ask some really powerful questions in that initial conversation with a prospective therapist. Like they can ask, what are your feelings about this topic? Let's say of, sexual abuse. What are your feelings about like the protocols in place in certain organizations in and their follow through in recourse for sexual abuse? What are your feelings around sexual behavior in general? You can ask lots of questions there, and feel free to throw in other ideas. So I think bottom line for me in this whole experience has been, I really would love clients to know that they are actually very allowed to ask a prospective therapist quite a few questions about their feelings about a certain topic that they are going to be talking about intimately.
Yeah, I love that. I think this idea of going into a first session, I know some therapists will even say, I'll do a 15-minute consult with you before we ever meet. Some therapists are not necessarily willing to do that, but you can definitely use this as part of your first session, is have some questions prepared for the provider you're seeing. What's your approach? What's your training? Have you had specific training, and from what organizations, or was it more of like a specific training just from a particular therapist, that has already a certain take, and what's their take on these things? I think those are really important questions. I think one question that is really coming up for me a lot as I'm hearing, because now of course people are reaching out to me about all kinds of things. I've heard about like lots of people are talking to me about the Sons of Helaman, which the Rolling Stones did an article about that I was quoted in, I think a year ago or so. I've been hearing things about the Greg Bear group. I've been hearing, all kinds of, there's just, it's really scary to think how many very popular, very seemingly successful either practices or approaches are having quite a few very problematic issues. And the number one thing I'm picking up on is you can't disagree with the therapist. You can't disagree with the therapist. So one of those questions that you may want to consider asking is, what happens when, your particular approach or your particular recommendations don't sit well with me, or I just, if I have a different opinion, how can we best work through those kinds of things? And I think a good provider will be like, I welcome that. In fact, I want to hear that. If I'm sharing something that is not sitting well, if you don't tell me, I don't know. I'm offering suggestions, but that some of those may fit within your values, your beliefs, your ideas, and some of them may not. And it's very helpful for me to know. I think another red flag is that there's a one-way plan. This is the program. This is the program. And if you don't do these particular things, then you're not going to quote unquote get well or have a good marriage. There's no such thing. There's 500,000 theoretical ways to approach any one issue. And in some cases, we actually do have standards of care for example, how you treat clinical depression or how you treat PTSD. But even within those standards of care, there's therapists that will offer many options within those standards of care that you can find something, hopefully, that you're comfortable with, right? So this one way, and if you don't agree with me, you're in trouble somehow, are huge red flags. Anyway, what else? Maybe Jenny, what are you thinking as far as all these things?
Yeah, just in terms of like maybe helping the public kind of feel very educated, so they feel, that they have some good guidelines to when they're working with an ethical therapist. I think I appreciate the conversation so far and totally echo all that. What I would add is you can always ask your therapist, like, have you been in therapy yourself? Do you currently have a therapist? Have you recently seen one? And or do you have like a supervisor or a mentor that you can go to if you get kind of in some sort of snafu that you need to work through? A lot of us in our helping profession do have colleagues and mentors that we want to tap and talk to from time to time. The other thing I was going to bring up is, when we're talking about sexuality. So don't assume that every licensed health professional has expertise when it comes to sexuality. So we were just discussing this earlier in our meeting, but a lot of our program may or may not even require one class around sexuality. And if it is included, it's just going to be a very broad strokes information type of teaching space. If you want to talk to a therapist about sexuality, ask about what their training has been in that. So for all of us here in talking to you today, we have or are pursuing certification in ASECT, which is sex therapy. So that's a 2-year program for a lot of us. It's at minimum 18 months, but a lot of us take more time with that because that's how complicated the field of sexuality is. So you do really want to make sure that your therapist is well informed about the topic that you want to talk to them about, and you can ask.
Yes, and I think that this is really important because especially in areas like pornography dilemmas, most of us did not receive any training on how to help. Even me as a marriage and family therapist, there was no specific training in my 2-year degree on how to work with pornography dilemmas, with a couple. So a lot of folks are coming up with kind of their own programs, their own ideas of how to help manage those kinds of things. A lot of that has been influenced by the sex addiction treatment protocol, which again is not clinically sound. There's no like evidence-based approach to the sex addiction program. Again, that was something that Patrick Carnes came up with back in the 80s, kind of as a solo practitioner, as a way to try to help folks. And that's developed into this certification that is not robust in its offerings and doesn't fall under clinically sound spaces. So, and both ASECT and MMHA have come out with position statements explaining that the sex addiction format is not a clinically sound way to deal with these issues. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues. That's, we're not saying, oh, you should just be fine and, this, anything goes type of approach. No, but it's like, if I say, okay, well, I don't think that using leeches to treat depression, which maybe in the past was an idea, I'm not saying, if I say that's not a clinically sound way to treat this issue, I'm not saying, oh, depression doesn't exist or there's no problem. I'm just saying that's not a clinically sound way to treat that particular issue. So that's what we're referring to. Stacy Jackson Roberts, who listens to our program, she's a therapist as well, has some interesting thoughts I want to share. She says it's also in our code of ethics, NASW, to first address issues interpersonally, which is kind of what Alan, you kind of spoke to, like when there's an issue with a therapist, like instead of just turning them in right away, it'd be best to kind of discuss it, especially if you know them personally. I had not heard of Jody Hildebrand until this case broke, so I wonder how much she was practicing in isolation or if those who knew her were avoiding it. And I agree with that. Those who are in private practice, I know I was in private practice for a long time before I started this group practice. It was really important to find networking opportunities. You can get kind of caught in your own echo chamber, if you're not constantly collaborating, attending conferences. All of us have to get some CEs, but even these days you can get CEs pretty isolated. They're available online. You can get, a lot of your CEs just by clicking a webinar. So you're not necessarily interacting or having to do that kind of more difficult work of being with professionals who may have different perspectives. Stacy also says, I also wonder how much of the resistance to requiring therapy, which Michelle was talking about, is a resistance from behaviorist-centered programs to psychoanalytic, psychodynamic models where that is infused as part of the training. So that's an interesting thought. I also have wondered, I mean, again, I'm not a huge fan of regulating even more. Sometimes some of the regulations that come out, we were just talking about some silly regulations about telehealth this morning that are just frustrating and that just, I think, cause barriers to care. But there's really no, for a person to become a therapist, there's no psychological evaluation required. There's no like clinical evaluation of that person's own well-being. As long as you have the academic rigor and the academic kind of credentials, you get accepted to a program, where that's not the case necessarily for other professions. Like I know it's the case for FBI, or I think some other types of professions where you're going to be working with very sensitive material and with people. And you know, how many of us within the profession have our own issues with personality disorders, have our own issues with unresolved trauma, and not that we're supposed to be 100% okay to be a therapist. All of us, any person's going to have issues, but I'm wondering if there should be a more robust screening process. That's just something I'm thinking about. Any other thoughts about this, Jody Hildebrandt?
I have one more, just another, just for the public to kind of determine, really good fits with a professional, is a lot of our programs, and there's a few of them out there. So you have an LMFT, you have a master's in social work, you have like sorry, I don't know the other one, clinical
Professional
mental health
counselor.
Thank you. All of them are going to agree that best practices is that the client needs to self-determine for themselves according to their value what they want to do in their life. It's not our job to impose our values onto theirs. It's our job to sit with them in their own ethical dilemmas about what they want to do. We can provide good education if there is something that is lacking, but this is very much part of all of our training, is to not ever impose our values onto our clients. Their best mental health will come by self-determining for themselves within their own value framework what's going to be a good fit for them.
Yeah, and I think that that's tricky. And I'd love to hear your perspectives on this. I think that I have oftentimes run into that when I do offer psychoeducation, what I consider psychoeducation, basically like this is what the research says, this is what we know, this is how folks can be most effective in managing something as tender as pornography or sexuality or sexual trauma, that then people feel like I'm imposing my values because the education I'm offering does not always match with their belief systems. Any thoughts about that dilemma?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the code of ethics that I'm under as a social worker, and I'm glad Jenny brought this up because that's always kind of the first principle, right? Is client self-determination comes first. What they feel is best for themselves is what we honor at all times. We don't act as an expert on their lives. They are the expert on their lives. And the only times that a therapist should ever interfere with that is if they perceive that that client intends harm to themselves or to others. That question of harm, I think, gets really hazy because of what you were saying, Natasha, where somebody might say, like Jody did, and I think Ruby Frankie did also, but there is harm being done to this person. For example, if they're looking at porn or they're masturbating, that old narrative of they're doing harm to themselves, and so I must step in. There's this point in time where maybe something that would be seen as inappropriate normally is actually very loving here because you're harming yourself and I need to save you from that. So this can become a really hazy process really fast. But I think for me, the bottom line is, can you respect that this client is saying, I do not see this as harmful to myself. I actually really am experiencing this as something helpful and meaningful in my life. And can the therapist step down from that? Typically, in that code of ethics, when it talks about intending harm to yourself or others, it's in the form of suicidality or homicidality. Everything else is kind of a matter of determination on the part of that client. And the therapist has to trust that.
Right. Which I know is one of the things I'm having to challenge myself on all the time, because when I see shame as very harmful, right, to a person's sexual development or sexual pleasure. But when they see maybe those what I would call shame practices as part of their religious practice or worship, then that is hard for me to step back from that, right? So I recognize that that's an area I'm kind of having to constantly work on in my own countertransference, right? And I do a lot of consultation about those kinds of issues when they come up for me, and we consult about these kinds of things all the time. Jenny, I know you need to go. Any last words from you?
No, this is great. I wish I could say as a part of this conversation. It's a good one.
Yeah,
Take care, y'all. Have a good weekend.
thank you. So kind of along these lines, about a month ago, the Salt Lake Tribune broke another story about another therapist who was, sexually abusing several of his clients who were in particular gay men. And this therapist was basically putting himself forward as a specialist or whatever in regards to providing therapy to men who are looking for same-sex attraction counseling. And I kind of put same-sex attraction in quotations because we understand that in this field, usually when you're talking about same-sex attraction, instead of just saying LGBT or gay clients, what that's really kind of signaling is that the therapist is basically of some type of religious bias and sees same-sex attraction as an issue that needs to be treated versus an identity that a person has as a gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender person. Okay, so it just says that this is another issue that we probably need to bring up. So one of his clients turned him in, turned in a report to Doppel. Like, I think if you go to Doppel right now, I'm not sure because I haven't checked it daily, but the last time I checked about a week ago, Jody Hildebrandt is still a licensed professional in the state of Utah. So just because reports are placed, these regulatory boards, it's a challenge. It's a process to lose your license. It's not like a report is made and a person is put immediately on suspension or loses their license immediately, and then they retain that license later. So for this report says for nearly 2 years after Andrew's report, which is one of the person who turned this therapist Owen in, Owen provided therapy to clients, some of whom were men referred for same-sex attraction. And guess who's referring clients for same-sex attraction counseling? Many times, it's not always, but many times, especially here in the state of Utah, it's LDS leaders, Latter-day Saint leaders, bishops, stake presidents, folks from the addictions program, quote unquote, that the church has, which we know through anecdotal just experience that very few people who attend the church's addiction program are really there for substance use, which is typically when we think more about addiction. They're usually there for sexual issues. And during that time, at least 3 more patients alleged that they were sexually abused by Owen, including 2 who reported him to the state licensing body in 2018. Those reports did ultimately lead to Owen agreeing to surrender his license. But this just goes to show some of the issues that we have with regulation, even though our fields are regulated. I've heard of, for example, professors at a university where sexual allegation has come forward, and usually they're put on suspension with pay or without pay, but they're kind of like, okay, we're taking you out of the field until we figure out and have the investigation, and you can't continue to harm in that investigative process. Now, of course, if you're accused inappropriately, that can be very hard, right? Like, oh, I'm put on leave. I don't feel like I did anything wrong, but I have to now wait for this investigation process. So there's issues on both sides. But again, are we protecting more the professionals or are we protecting the public? And I think how this is set up is that it's more about protecting the professionals. So anybody want to share some thoughts about, this particular story with Scott Owen?
It's really sad because if these men are struggling with quote unquote same-sex attraction, if they are indeed on this sexual identity journey of themselves, this discovery process, this sexual development is what it really is. And then that's being interfered with in a traumatic way. Now we have somebody who was already going through a hard enough process that has now been traumatized about that process and may never trust getting into counseling again. And now you have somebody who's going to struggle outside of the system that could give them help for the rest of their lives, potentially. And this is the real harm is, everybody thinks it's the incident, the pebble in the pool, but that ripples throughout lives and throughout the lives they touch and are associated with through their families. And this is where that's where the real harm is done. And that any individual, especially, systemically as a social worker, Michelle, relationally as marriage and family therapist for me and Natasha, we all understand the interconnectedness of this and how this can ripple out and really affect more lives than that one. But that one should be our focus. And that the fact that this is allowed to continue is disturbing. In every other instance I can think of, whether it's a police-involved shooting, they're usually assigned to desk duty, anything of an ethical nature in like any other law enforcement or sensitive area, people are usually given some sort of restricted duty or put on, a leave, like college professors. Even if you just refuse a breathalyzer and you don't get tested, your license is still suspended. At least, well, I'm speaking for myself here. I'm sure that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But the point is that usually systems where there's harm to the public can occur or greater harm to individuals can occur. Usually there's a pause button that gets pushed. And it seems like the system's lacking a pause button here.
Michelle.
Yeah, I'm again just as I'm listening to Alan, I'm like, okay, so in the absence of that, again, what can the client do? And I'm thinking of one of the ideas that is thrown around a lot in the therapist world is providing unconditional positive regard for your clients. And with that, I would say like unconditional positive like acceptance of them as well. And so I think a lot of clients go into therapy, and especially if they're not as experienced or they don't know as much about the field, that they can kind of question like, what should the experience be like? And I feel like a lot of clients come in feeling like, oh, I'm supposed to feel really invalid, like I'm lacking, like I'm depraved, like there's something wrong with me. Like I would say 99% of my clients come in and that's how they are. They're like, please tell me what's wrong with me and please fix me. And I make it clear to them, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with you. And if you think that there's something wrong with you, based off how I'm treating you, that's a problem. And we need to talk about that. I hope that you will always feel comfortable pushing back against certain things that I say or how I make you feel, because you should always be walking away feeling empowered and feeling like it makes sense that you're experiencing the things that you are in your life. If you feel crazier as a result of seeing me, I haven't done my job. So I think, again, in terms of protecting clients from any kind of abuse from therapists, in the absence of some more established way to keep therapists accountable and safe, I would really hope that clients just pay attention to and give themselves permission to really notice, how do they feel as a result of being in a therapist's presence? Because they should be feeling more empowered to listen to their intuition, trust their own judgments, and be taking steps towards their happiest, healthiest life. But if they're always walking away kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful for my therapist because I could never live a good life without them. Yikes. Like that is way too much power in the therapist's hands.
Yeah, I appreciate all those comments. And I think I return to this constant ethical dilemma that I feel like I'm constantly, I feel like I've figured out a lot of things in 30 years of being a therapist, almost 30 years. But there's some things I'm like, oh, I just have not figured this out. I have not figured this out. On the one hand, I have this huge value and principle of respecting people where they're at in regards to their religious beliefs. In fact, so much of the presentations that I've given throughout my career are training therapists in particular to not be microaggressive to Latter-day Saints folks, right? Because people are not necessarily educated about Mormonism very well and can make a lot of mistakes in being pretty upsetting to folks who are trying to live in a way that's attuned to their values. And then, of course, I have this other part of myself that is very, I value mental health. I value sexual health. I believe in those principles. I believe in research. I believe in science. And when I read this, so let me just read a few of these comments on paragraphs in this article. So Andrew was one of the folks that turned this Greg Owens person in to Doppel. He was 22 years old. He just returned from a mission. He was attending a singles ward in Provo, right? So it's a local congregation for unmarried college students. But he's gay, right? And so what's one of the major tenets in Latter-day Saint faith? If you're going to be culturally sensitive, well, it's that marriage can only happen between a man and a woman. So right there, right in that moment, I'm at odds with both of my values as both a member of my community and also as a therapist, right? And so same-sex marriage is not an option in the church. So he went to his bishop, which we know this is what happens like a majority of the time. Even the research will show that folks will usually go to an ecclesiastical leader over a therapist if they come from a religious background, because they have a trusting relationship with their clergy, with their bishops, their pastors, their whatever tradition they come from. So the lay leader suggested trying therapy. Okay, so the bishop said he had just gotten a referral for this therapist named Scott Owen, who worked well, quote unquote, with gay men who were members of their faith. Well, what is working well for an LDS bishop going to look like? Working well means keeping that gay person from being sexual or romantic with another gay person. That's what working well means, which is antithetical to what it would mean for us as mental health professionals to do LGBTQ affirming therapy. So we are at odds. And this is a dilemma that I'm not sure anybody has truly, really addressed at the level of robusticity that I would like to see in regards to all of our fields. So this man, Owen, he co-owns this Provo therapy business called Canyon Counseling. He's also, so here's a dual relationship. He is also a regional leader in a Provo area stake, which is similar to a Catholic diocese. So he's serving two hats, right? On the one hand, he goes to work and he's supposed to be a professional therapist. On Sundays, he's got the hat of a religious leader, because in LDS culture, we have lay leadership. So now he's the advice or thoughts that he's supposed to give as a stake leader versus the thoughts and ideas he's supposed to give as a professional therapist are diametrically opposed. I even considered this when I was getting excommunicated, like the stake president who excommunicated me as an executive at a major, major company in our Wichita area, which has in its values, we're not to discriminate against sexual orientation. We're not supposed to discriminate against, all these things. That's the company's values. But on Sunday, he's the stake president excommunicating me for supporting gay marriage, but then goes to work on Monday and supposedly doesn't discriminate. So these are just these dual boundaries or dual relationships. And and so he, Andrew says it was like God has a plan, right? Here's this religiously vulnerable 22-year-old. He goes to see this professional therapist who now has a plan to help him solve same-sex attraction, which is conversion therapy, which, by the way, has been made illegal for minors in about half of the states of the United States, but not for adults. So even though it's completely unethical treatment, it still happens. About 5 months in, right? So getting the trust, doing the grooming, Andrew says that this person encouraged him to undress and kissed him during sessions. And Andrew said Owen told him that the touching was a therapeutic way to learn how to accept love and intimacy, which is also what I've heard about Greg Bear doing with heterosexual women, which is a lot of what these soft conversion programs encourage people to do in kind of like wilderness camps or things like that for adults, about getting naked and holding each other. You know, I think another thing we need to be very clear about with folks is that any type of sexual touch or undressing, even if nobody has touched you, but to ask you to undress as part of a mental health therapy session is completely not correct. That does not fall under any sort of ethical practice. And in fact, that's the number one way that we can lose our licensees, is to either one, have sex with our clients, or be sexually inappropriate with our clients. And that's considered, you know, unprofessional conduct. So, you know, and then let's look at what Owen would say. You know, he built a reputation as a therapist with Christian values, right? Latter-day Saint values, who could help Latter-day Saint men with same gender attraction, which is just a phrase for conversion therapy. He gave public lectures, you know, about pornography and masturbation. And I can guarantee you that because of his relationship with the church, a lot of those public lectures were firesides or, you know, places where he could do that at the church space. And Owen told a crowd of LGBTQ plus members in 2016 that he had earned the nickname the Porn King. Right? So he's going to help you solve all these problems. And of course, when these things get brought up, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints usually says, well, we didn't know. It's not our responsibility to track therapists and whether or not they're unethical. And when you say, well, but your leaders referred to this person on a multiple basis, like what happened with Jody Hildebrandt, well, we can't control what our local leaders do. So the accountability is never actually brought about. And we know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a propensity to only refer to therapists who would fall under basically being toe in line with their religious teachings.
Agreed. I don't know. I don't have anything to add on anything else. And I've just been nodding our heads.
I'm thinking, well, I'll never get a referral from them, and that's okay. You know, because yeah, I would never align with what the church or any religious authority wanted. I would align with what my client wanted. Because it's not about me, and it's not about them, the church or the institution or the organization or whoever is referring. You know, even if it's a corporation that has very different values than the client, and it's through an employee assistance program or something, I'm not there to enforce the company's values or idea of health. I'm there to see if what the client needs. And it's always about that client, and we always put them first. And I just don't know how many other times or different ways that we can say that, you know. But I want the public, obviously not enough. We need to keep saying it. But that's the thing we want the public to know, is it's always about you. It's always about your values, your goals, what you want. It's never about what we want. Our job is to move you from a position of lesser functioning to greater functioning, from a position of lesser autonomy to greater autonomy. You're supposed to be the one that's in the driver's seat as far as where therapy's headed, what your goals are, and where you're eventually arriving. Never forget that. It's about you. You're paying the money. You're the boss. Get what you want.
Yep.
I think one of the reasons why, you know, we rage against these systems as therapists is because we see how much harm they can do to our clients. And I don't even mean just like high demand religion, but really any system that we grow up in. I remember taking a class in grad school on, it was called Human Behavior in the Social Environment. And it was, the whole idea is that, you know, you're so impacted by like countless systems that you're born into that are telling you how to be, how to feel, how to show up in the world. And as a therapist, you have this really weird job of helping a client recognize the impact of those systems and then very purposefully decide how they want to show up in each of those different systems, because those systems aren't going away. They're always going to be there, and they're always going to exert power and influence over our lives and how we perceive ourselves. But if we can bring some kind of conscious awareness to that, then we're like doing our job a little bit more. But it's so hard, because so often when I hear clients talk about different systems that they're in, I feel myself getting angry, or I'm kind of like, wow, like you gotta kind of decrease the influence that the system has on you. But since we can't do that, nor would we necessarily want to take people out of their systems, because systems can also be really powerful and influencing us for good and helping us and enriching our lives. I think part of the work of therapy is just helping clients more consciously orient themselves to those different systems in ways that don't marginalize them or harm them, but instead, empower them.
Right. Yeah, and it's going back even to the Jodi Hildebrandt case. I think this is where it's so tender to work with, in particular for me, women, from my background, who do see somebody like Jodi Hildebrandt empowering them, right? I get to tell my husband he can't do these things. I get to kick him out of the house. I get to be very vindicated and validated in the pain that's very real. I know what pornography pain feels like. I've lived through that personally. I've been taught the same reactions and the same ideas around some of those issues. It took me many years to deconstruct a lot of that for myself, and to get, the information that would help me both personally and professionally help folks in those spaces. And so that's I think that also one of the struggles when you're a therapist, that you're like, I think there could be a better approach to this, right? I think that there could be an approach that could actually help you in sustainable ways. But where you're feeling empowered, like you just said, Michelle, is a space that I diametrically opposed to, right? And so from a professional perspective, forget the religious perspective, right? So that's very hard. It's very hard to sit in those spaces. And I know I've messed that up tons of times with clients where, I maybe went too quickly to information, or, didn't sit with the pain sufficiently enough before I just wanted to offer a solution. I mean, all of us, I think, have made a lot of mistakes as therapists. That's how we grow and learn.
We're human too.
Yeah, we're human too, right? Exactly. But I think there's a difference between being human and making mistakes and actually practicing ongoingly unethical practices.
Absolutely.
That somehow you have justified or validated for yourself. All right, so moving on before we totally lose time.
That operating in isolation was a really great point that came up in the comments. And that's a really great thing, is that's when you do fall into your own blind spot, because in your own echo chamber. And that's why even if I was not part of Symmetry in a group practice, it was always drilled into me in my grad program that you have a consultation group. You need other outside professionals to check on you. It's part of the system, how we balance and check each other. And so therapists operating in isolation seems really dangerous to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. So another thing that happened, I think just a few weeks ago, is that Netflix released a documentary about the Boy Scouts. It's called Scouts Honor: The Secret Files of the Boy Scouts of America, which is an interesting, why would we bring that up here? Well, first of all, because the main issue that they're dealing with is sexual abuse, and how many people who've been through the scouting program have experienced some form of sexual assault or sexual abuse, either by other youth in the program that were older than them and or leaders in the program. And it really talks about this systemic way, because again, like I said earlier with the church will be like, well, we're not the problem. We're not if one of our bishops referred to one of these people, that's not our problem, right? Which lacks systemic accountability. Like, what's happening? Why are our bishops referring to these kinds of folks? Why, are we training our bishops? Are we doing the systemic work to address something that seems to be happening on a fairly regular basis within our community, right? That's, I think, what lacks is that systemic accountability. And so the Boy Scouts had a very similar problem with dealing with sexual abuse. It's very easy to say, well, in every community, there's going to be predators. And that's true. but this was so systemic. And the way that the Boy Scouts organization dealt with this issue was so problematic in not addressing that systemic concern. And of course, I know, Alan, you don't come from a Latter-day Saint background, but you come from a religious background yourself. And the primary organizations that were, aligned with the Boy Scouts of America were religions, like Catholic spaces, Baptist spaces, Jewish spaces, all had, like kind of informal or even formal partnerships with the Boy Scouts of America, one of which, and probably the largest, was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church. Had a very, very close tie. And in fact, the Boy Scouts program was officially incorporated into the youth program of the church for young boys in this capacity. Whereas a lot of other churches, it was more like informal. Like if you wanted to have a troop, you could, but it wasn't necessarily part of the formal process of the young men going through that program. So the church broke ties with the Boy Scouts of America, I forget what year, but fairly recently, due to not wanting to be inclusive to gay leaders and gay Boy Scouts. So that was that's a whole nother issue. But what happened is that this person called Michael Johnson, who was a former police detective who specialized in protections of children and child assault, was hired by the Boy Scout Association as its youth protection director. And over the decade that he worked with them, found many, many concerns and issues. And when he would try to implement systemic safeguards, there was way too much resistance to those systemic safeguards. Not to mention the lawyers that were interviewed in the film as well, which, shared how many files had just been kind of put on a shelf and ignored. And even though there were, even back in the early 1900s, people that were put on what was called a perversion list, which is what they called it back then, like perpetrators that had been found out, there was no way to really systemically protect. So a perpetrator would just move to another space and become a Boy Scout leader in that space, even though there had been a problem with him in this particular geographical area. And this is really, really problematic on many levels. And I will say that I had quite a bit of a reaction watching the person who was representing the Boy Scouts of America, because again, his name was Steve McGowan, and he was doing what I feel like LDS leaders do often, like just deflecting blame, saying we're a good organization. Just because we have a few problems doesn't mean that we're problematic as a whole. And it was very angering to me to watch his reactions to very, I think, crucial and valid complaints and issues that the organization was facing. Not to mention that those who, and this whole issue of bankruptcy, so the Boy Scouts of America has filed for bankruptcy, which really, again, protects the organization, not so much the victims. So the victims then will only be allowed to have so many monies allotted, and they had to have, basically they had to come forward with their stories by a certain date, or else you wouldn't be part of that main lawsuit. So lots of problems with that. And if there's any reactions from the two of you, especially with so many folks who are LDS being part of this program.
Well, I can't help but feel the parallel with the Catholic Church on this. And here's the thing. When you repress who people are, that whatever you repress is still going to get expressed, but in an unhealthy way. It forces it into secrecy and into toxicity and into legality and into coerciveness. because it cannot be tolerated as just a natural human state by these organizations. This is what drove it underground and into secrecy, and why abuse occurred so systemically within the Catholic Church. Same thing with the Boy Scouts. And they're not the only ones. I hear from plenty of LDS and ex-LDS members. They've been abused by church leaders. It's a problem for any organization that denies the natural humanity of people and then forces them to repress it. It is the repression that is the problem. It is the inability to accept people as who they really are. And that's the real crime here. That's the overarching crime. But the victims are countless, because there's so many who don't come forward and will never come forward. So the harm needs to stop, is the point here. The harm needs to stop. And I'm not going to deny that plenty of people have absolutely fantastic lives and experiences in the Catholic Church. Same thing, Mormonism serves people in wonderful ways, and many of them are very happy with it. Same thing with Boy Scouts. I'm not going to deny that there aren't people that have had fantastic experiences in the Scouts, all the way from Webelos and then into Cub Scouts and all the way up to your Eagle Scout. There are people who have had fantastic things and it's benefited them greatly. But for the people that it doesn't, it seems like there's always somebody else we have to other, that we can't accept them. We have to sinify them. We have to call them an abomination. And those are the people we're harming. We're not being Christian towards them, if you ask me. And that in itself is a sin.
Yeah, you're making me think of, Carl Jung and his whole discussion of the shadow. The shadow is everything that we feel is unallowable or unacceptable about ourselves. And so in this case, if we're saying, if you have any kind of sexuality that deviates from that like monogamous heterosexual type of orientation, it is unallowable, and therefore force it into the shadow and hide it. And like you said, it will, when it is repressed, it will be expressed. And so we've got these cultural norms that are being enforced by high demand religion and other cultural pressures that are just creating these huge shadows. Like, can we just make more things allowable? Can we actually have more honest conversations about, hey, maybe some of these ways of living and being in the world are quite okay? And if so, then can we navigate them in appropriate ways that are resourced? Yeah, I'm so there with you, Alan. It's so sad to see the effects of the long shadows that we're casting on our societies.
Yeah, especially with sexual repression. One of our commenters, Trevor, says, I wonder how much of abuse, mostly by peers or older or younger kids, is only traumatic because of the religious framework that makes us afraid of sex and weren't necessarily abusive in nature, but rather it is the shame and fear-based framing of sex in these circles that causes the actual problem, not the act itself. I would say, I think that kind of goes along with what you're both saying as far as the shadows and the shame and the inability to have, comprehensive sexual education and resources and outlets that are normative and allowed and developmentally healthy at the same time. And I think this documentary did a very good job of this. I'm not going to repeat some of the language because I haven't prepared really the audience for triggers, but they were very clear that, I think that the term sexual abuse is almost like, does it even mean anything anymore when we hear that term? And so one of the things that Michael Johnson did in this documentary was describe in detail how these sexual acts were perpetrated and what types of sexual acts we're talking about. And so by no means do we ever want to minimize how horrifying those acts can be when you've got, a young child or teen who is unprepared and who's in a trusting relationship, usually with the folks who are off perpetrating these acts. And one of the things too that they shared is that the pedophiles and sexual perpetrators who were interviewed and caught and sent to prison oftentimes would say, well, the Boy Scouts was a super easy access point. I mean, that was it was purposeful, it was intentional. And a lot of the boys that were targeted, which we know it's about kind of sexual abuse perpetration in general, is that if you have a vulnerable kid, they're more than often targeted. So a lot of these leaders would go and recruit boys from like single mother homes, neighborhoods where there was more poverty, would offer to sign up the Boy Scouts for free. So there was a very intentional approach to this that is very malicious. I think other things that I just think about when I think about the Boy Scouts, stigmas of boys being abused by another male is alive and well. So we know that the reporting by male sexual abuse victims is lower, not necessarily because there's less boys that are abused than girls, but just because the stigma of coming forth as a man who's been sexually abused by another man in particular, but really by anybody, is the stigma there is still very, very high, with a lot of ideas about toxic masculinity and what it means to be a sexual man and to be, powerful as a man in your sexuality. That can feel very, very disorienting and confusing to folks. So there's incredibly brave storytelling in this documentary. I was so impressed by the abuse victims who came forth and how they told their stories. Also, the other thing I want to just point out that happened, not just in the LDS Church, but in our culture at large, and definitely in the Boy Scouts of America, was this myth against gay men. Right. So one of the ways that they tried to solve this problem was, well, we just won't let any gay leaders be part of the Boy Scouts, because this assumption that gay people are pedophiles, or that will do things to young men. We see this argument right now with transgender folks, right? Oh, well, we can't let transgender folks into a bathroom because they're just perpetrators, right? And so people need to educate themselves that the number one perpetrator in this country is a straight man. It's the number one perpetrator in this country is a straight man. And that sexual abuse is not really about sexual orientation. It's about power. It's about accessibility. And sometimes it's about pedophilia, right? But primarily it's about access and power. And it's primarily straight men who are perpetrating in these communities. So that's really, really important for people to understand. It's not the gay and transgender folks that are abusing all of our kids. That's just ridiculous and adds its own level of discrimination and bias to so many members of our society who are wonderful people. I'm with you, Alan, that the Boy Scouts is, I think for a lot of folks has been a wonderful organization. I know that I've many family members, several family members who are Eagle Scouts and who loved going to scout camps and who loved a lot of that camaraderie. I don't think oftentimes, especially for men, that there are spaces where they can congregate and feel that camaraderie as boys or men, especially since we've really been working on deconstructing, sexism and misogyny. So I understand that there's tenderness around those issues for men as well. So I'm not saying I'm against the Mormon Church, or I'm against Boy Scouts, or I'm against the Catholics. I'm against systemic issues that are not being addressed. And oftentimes one of the things that was said in this documentary is because you want people to like you want people to join the Boy Scouts, you want the people to join the church, you want people to convert, those systems get much more concerned about the brand and protecting the organization than they do about really doing the work of protecting the individuals that are hurt within that organization. Because if we say, yes, abuse happens, or we need to fix some things, or we need to apologize, then maybe people won't want to join us. And what's really upsetting or sad about that is that actually the reverse is true. Most people will trust an organization more when they see them doing the hard work and not just like having this like la la land approach to whatever issues any organization is going to have. So any final thoughts before we take off today?
Just to kind of coattail on your white males are the predominant predator, perpetrator. And the other side of that coin is it's our LGBTQ youth that are actually largely victimized because they are identified as vulnerable youth, and it's the vulnerable youth that a lot of times are the ones that tend to be abused because they know that there's shame around their identity and there's shame around that act, and shame equals silence in a lot of cases to me.
Thank you. Any final thoughts from you, Michelle, today on any of these topics?
Yeah, no, I just love how you ended that of, yeah, I don't think any of us are like majorly against these systems. We're against the problems in them. Like if we can take an honest approach to and real steps towards trying to resolve them, we're all for any of these organizations continuing insofar as they show that they're committed to the well-being of their adherents.
Yeah. And I've appreciated how you've always brought back the conversation today, Michelle, to the public, like, because there's all these systems issues, and there's regulation and there's therapists and there's professionals, but what can the public do? And so I think we'll end with that note that education is super important, right? Education, diversity of resources in that education that hopefully aligns. And I would say being willing to hold those that you consider in power accountable, whether it's through police reporting, whether it's through regulation reporting, like Doppel here in Utah, and even if it's reporting within your own family systems or community systems, being willing or able or finding some way to safely say, this is not okay, and I need help with this particular issue. So education and accountability, I would say, are a lot of what we can hopefully have in our hands.
And I used to work heavily on school campuses with middle school and high schoolers, especially around bullying and mental health issues and things like that. And one of the things we always used to tell them is don't be a bystander, be an upstander. Stand up for what's right. Stand up for others that are victimized. So if you see something, say something.
Yeah, exactly. And Trevor again comments, education is important, but when the very group that is most in need of education, children and adolescents, are most vulnerable, are legally prevented from having any such education. Yes. And this is where it goes back to, this is where I struggle, right? Like on the one hand, I'm a huge proponent of parent rights. On the other hand, should parents have the right to teach their kids that being gay is sinful? Is that emotional abuse? We've decided that you don't have the right to beat your children anymore, even though we do agree that we're a country of parental rights. But when are we going to make those steps of emotional abuse, and who gets to decide? And I think this is why we see a lot of upheaval and anxiety around transgender rights and sexual education in the schools, because folks who come from maybe more conservative or high demand religions are very worried that their right to tell their own child that presenting in a certain way is not okay will be made, incorrect parental behavior. But when we see the effects of that parental right, even just educationally and mentally, and the effects that has on folks and how damaging that is and how that increases suicide and increases mental health symptoms and increases substance abuse, even though I know most parents are really coming from a protective space and as far as their intention, this is where the ethics and the morality of systemic shifts and changes in our country are very complex. And I'm just calling all of us to enter that realm of conversation and dialogue and education instead of, trying to act from spaces of fear or, can we look at our own biases? So I think we are in a dilemma. We are in lots of ethical dilemmas, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable who do not have the right to educate themselves and are taken away from those kinds of resources. Thank you all for a very interesting and I think important and robust discussion on things that are happening in our communities today, right here, right now. Have a good day, everybody.
You take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland.